It's easy to make mistakes when you edit table data. So most databases have a transaction system that lets you verify that you want to make your change. Transactions work by accepting your changes as temporary input and letting you ask the user if they're sure they want to make the change. If so, Access completes the transaction. If not, it returns the table to its previous state and discards the changes. The table we will work with is the clients table, so I'll just double-click that over in the navigation pane to open it. And the table is in the state that it was in after I completed the exercise in the previous movie. But what's important is that the client salesperson field contains a value of 2. So if there's at least one record there that contains a 2 in that field, then fine. If not, then go ahead and change any of the values in the client salesperson field to 2 so that the code will run properly. In this case, it's the client ID number 2, Buena Suerte, that has a client salesperson value of 2. So that's the one that will be changed. I'll press Ctrl W to close the table, and we're going to work with the Use Transactions Code module. It's all the way at the bottom of the Modules section of the navigation pane. I'll double click it, and it appears inside the Visual Basic Editor. Now, there's a lot of code here, so instead of having you type anything in, I'm going to save some time and just go through what the code does. We'll start out with the declaration for the subroutine named adding transactions, and then I define 2 variables. The first is myR, which is a record set, and then the second is myWS, which is a workspace. Then I assign the clients table to the myR record set and the existing workspace, in other words, the user environment inside of Access, to the variable myWS. And we use workspaces so that we have access to transactions. And in fact, the very next statement is myWS begin transactions. In other words, we're about to affect a table, but Access is going to make sure that it gets a commit statement before it actually implements or applies any of those changes to the table data. Now the code is going to go through each row in the record set until it reaches the end of file. That is what the do until myr.eof and then loop code does. Within that loop, it's going to look at the client salesperson field for each row, and if that field contains the value of 2, then it's going to open that row for editing, and it's going to change the client salesperson value to 1, and then it will update. But again, that update isn't final because we're in transaction mode and we haven't seen a commit transaction statement yet. Then we close the if and move to the next row as long as we haven't reached end of file. When we do reach the end of file, we drop out of the loop and Access displays a message box. And that message box contains the text, changed salesperson 2 to 1, and asks save the changes. Now this message box has a question format and also yes and no buttons. If the user clicks the yes button, so that is why =VB yes is the condition for the if statement, then it commits the transaction. So it goes within the workspace object and implements the commit transaction method. If not, which is signaled by the else statement, it does a rollback. In other words, it discards the changes and leaves the table in its previous state. And then the rest of the code is used basically to undo what we did before. We close the if, then we close the record set, close the workspace, and set those 2 variables to nothing. So now we can run the code. I'll press F5, and then we flip back to the Access database window, and we see the message box indicating that the change occurred and asking if we want to save the changes. I'll click yes, and then we go back to the Visual Basic Editor because that's where we were when the code ran. Now press Alt F11 to go back to the main database window and double-click the clients table in the navigation pane to open it, and we see that the second record has indeed changed. The client salesperson value has changed from 2 to 1. Transactions are one way to maintain data integrity, but you should always back up important business data every day to make sure that, if a mistake does occur, you can rebuild your tables with recent data.